So what would you do if you knew that you had 18 months left to live? Or maybe 6 months? How would you approach each day? How would you approach each moment? What would you prioritize? I think when we're young that these questions can feel really abstract. They feel far off and distant. As a psychologist, I know that that makes sense, especially for teenagers, for adolescents, because the prefrontal cortex, the neuroimaging, the psychology research shows that the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that understands the finality of death and can plan and feel a sense of caution, isn't fully developed until the age of 25 years old. But for many of us, regardless of our age, there is a before and an after. And for me, before my mother's death, I didn't understand the impact of mortality. It felt like an idea. My mom was 53 years old when she died of a sudden, massive heart attack. My mom was my biggest cheerleader. She was there for me through every milestone of my life. She really encouraged my education, so she was there when I graduated from high school and with my bachelor's degree, my master's degree. And then she was the one who encouraged me to apply for this 4-year PhD program. So I was in the second year of my PhD program, and my son was 6 months old when she suddenly died. And her death felt surreal. It was in 2007, and so in 2007, we received these, it was kind of antiquated, we received these paper phone bills with our phone calls. It was a phone log, essentially. And it showed the phone calls that we made to and from each other. So in the month after she died, I received the phone bill for the month prior to her death, and it showed all of the phone calls that we'd made. And it actually had the number of minutes that we spoke. And I remember I pulled out a calculator and I added up the minutes that we talked. We talked nearly every day, so it added to the hundreds of minutes. And what I remember thinking is that I wish I had been more mindful in my conversations with her, because I could remember the themes about what we talked about. I remember that she gave me advice about being a new mom. I remember that she was encouraging me through this PhD program, which felt like a mountain to climb. But I couldn't remember the details, and I wish that I could remember the sound of her voice. I do remember on the day of her death, she was boarding a flight, and I remember that we talked, and the phone bill showed that we talked for 12 minutes. And I remember I complained about a dentist appointment that I had to go to the following week. I didn't want to go to the dentist. And after she died, I thought, what a silly thing to complain about. I wish I'd had more gratitude in that last conversation with her. So the week after she died, instead of going to the dentist, I went to her funeral that day instead. So her death shifted my perspective, and it made me understand the importance of mindfulness. But time passed, and I did indeed walk across the stage and graduate with my PhD. It was the first graduation my mom couldn't attend. But the grief diminished, my daughter was born, and time went on. The years passed, and the next time mortality came knocking on my door was when my good friend Gina Hollenbeck was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. Gina was 38 years old, the same age as me. We were born in the same year. And she was diagnosed with cancer at the age of 38. Gina was so similar to me. She was from the same hometown, Memphis, Tennessee. Our children are around the same ages and went to the same schools. And Gina was the last person that you would expect to be diagnosed with cancer. She never smoked a day in her life. She was athletic and a runner. And so we were all shocked when she was diagnosed. Gina was a nurse, and so she knew that she needed to go for a second opinion. So she went to a top oncologist at a top clinic in the United States that specialized in her particular type of cancer. And unfortunately, he gave her an expiration date. He told her that she had 6 months left to live. Well, bless his heart, he didn't know Gina Hollenbeck. Gina was a fighter, a warrior. In the South, there's this term that was popularized in a movie a long time ago, but it's a term that's been around a long time, called still magnolias. Gina was a true still magnolia. It's the idea that a woman might have grace and compassion. She was the type of person who would leave homemade chocolate chip cookies on your doorstep if you were having a bad day. But she was the type of person that would face adversity and challenge with courage and determination. So when Gina was diagnosed, she had a religious worldview. She came from a spiritual background, and she described the cancer as an evil that came to destroy her. And I didn't understand exactly what she meant when she described it that way. But I began to understand a couple of years later, because a couple of years later, I was diagnosed with cancer. And when you hear the words from your doctor, you have cancer, it's easy to feel this sort of sense of fear or panic, even hopelessness or despair. And if you allow the panic to consume you, then the cancer wins. So that's what Gina meant. So when I was diagnosed with cancer, it was another before and after in my life. But when I was diagnosed with cancer, I was very lucky. I was diagnosed with stage 1 cancer. So that meant that it was operable, survivable. But I did have this risk factor called lymphovascular space invasion. When you are a cancer patient, you learn terminology that you never want to learn, that you never want to know about. But the way my doctor explained it to me is that my cancer cells had sort of grown or spread towards my lymph system, and that there was a possibility that the cancer cells had maybe sort of leaked into my lymph system. So because of this extra risk factor, I decided that I wanted to do the same thing as Gina and get a second opinion. So I was fortunate enough to be able to go to a top clinic and see a top oncologist. And the oncologist recommended that I have chemotherapy and radiation. But my local doctor, the doctor that I trusted, the doctor who actually had more years of experience, said, "Michelle, we've got it." And we caught the cancer just in time. And he said, if you have chemotherapy and radiation, it might actually cause more problems than it will solve. So I was caught in this sort of shadow of uncertainty. I was not in a clear diagnostic category. So I decided to gamble on his message of hope, and I decided to opt against the chemotherapy and radiation. But because of this extra risk factor, I did need to go in for monitoring. I had to go in for monitoring and follow-up imaging every 3 months after my surgery. And so I remember I went in at the 3-month mark and I was feeling anxious and panicky. I had not yet learned to face death and life as fully as Gina Hollenbeck. So I went in at the 3-month mark and it was clear. I didn't have any evidence of disease. I went in at the 6-month mark and it was clear again. And what I understood from my doctors was that the probability of a recurrence was the most likely in the first 2 years after the diagnosis. So I was trying and hoping that I might make it to this 2-year mark. I went in at 12 months, and again, it was no evidence of disease. It's what every cancer patient wants to hear, NED, no evidence of disease. But then I went in for the 15-month scan, the 15-month imaging, and the radiology report was different. It said suspicious for recurrence, consistent with malignancy, clinical correlation indicated. So the imaging showed that I likely had a recurrence. So my doctor called me and said, clinical correlation indicated means that what we need to do is another surgery with all that entails to take a biopsy to determine if the imaging is correct. And I was really hopeful, so I asked, what's the probability that I've had a recurrence? What's the probability this is a false positive and the imaging is wrong? And my doctor said, well, for this particular type of imaging, the probability is 9 times out of 10, it's correct. So it's likely that you have had a recurrence. And so then I asked the next question, which I already knew the answer to, but I asked, what's the prognosis if it's a recurrence? And my doctor explained that because the imaging showed that the recurrence looked like it was maybe distant from the local site, the original site of the cancer, that the studies indicated that a recurrence, the probability of survival was probably around 15 to 18 months, even with chemotherapy and radiation. So suddenly, that question, what would you do if you had 18 months left to live, was very real. It was no longer an idea. I was facing my own mortality. And so, from the time that I received the radiology report until the time that I received the biopsy results was 16 days. And I remember being so mindful. I remember looking at my children's faces and trying to remember every single detail. I remember hoping and wishing I might have more time with them. I remember thinking that maybe I could make it to my son's graduation. He was my eldest, and so I thought maybe I'd have a chance, an opportunity to make it to his graduation. But I knew that I didn't have the luxury of thinking about a future. I knew that suddenly the only moment that existed was now. So at the 16-day mark, my doctor did call me and told me that it was a false positive. I didn't have cancer. The biopsy was clear. I felt like I won the lottery. I won the lottery of more time. But those 16 days in which I thought that I might be facing months instead of the years that I hoped to live, profoundly and fundamentally changed me. I faced the fear of mortality, and so death lost its sting. Suddenly, I learned to live more fully. So time passed, and Gina, who was there with me during that entire journey, was my friend, Gina continued to fight. Gina lived for 7 years, not the 6 months originally predicted. She lived for 7 years. And in 2022, her son graduated from high school, but she was too sick to attend the ceremony. And around 2 weeks later, on June 12th of 2022, my friend Gina Hollenbeck died. And then 2 years later, in June of 2024, I was so lucky that I was able to attend my son's graduation. I didn't know if that would be able to happen, but it did. I was there. So I remember being in that graduation ceremony, and ironically, there was this clock behind the stage, the setup of the ceremony. And I remember looking at the clock and watching the time tick and just feeling the significance of time, and being so mindful and grateful to be in that moment. I remember wishing that my mother could have been there to see her grandson graduate. And I remember wishing that Gina had seen her sons walk across the stage and had been there for the milestones she had hoped to see. I know she would have been so proud of them. But I was there in that moment, and that was a gift. And so Gina and I both faced that same question. What would you do if you had months left to live? And like I said, it profoundly and fundamentally changed me. Now I run up mountains, both literal and figurative. I run up mountains in spite of my fear of heights. I do things that scare me. I volunteer to give TEDx talks. So now in this moment, I'm aware that our time is coming to an end, that this event is coming to an end. And so what I'd like to say to the younger people in the audience is that there will be before and after moments in your life. There will be before and after moments. They come for all of us, and it may not be cancer, but we all face the inevitable challenge and adversity. And so what I hope for you is that when you have those inevitable challenges, that you can face it, that you can face the fear, and that you can live so fully that the challenge or the adversity or even death can lose its sting. I hope that those challenges become opportunities to build resilience and to find meaning and clarity. But we don't have to wait. We don't have to wait for the inevitable tragedies and the inevitable challenges. So I'm going to end with the same questions that I began with. What would you do if you had 18 months left to live, or 6 months? How would you approach each day, each moment? What would you prioritize? And whatever your answer is, what I would say is, do it now.